Hello everybody and welcome to our Zoom into Soil webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andy Morris. I'm the Executive Director of the British Society of Soil Science, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our 8th webinar of the year. Before I welcome our presenters, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce you to the British Society of Soil Science as the hosts of today's webinar. We are an established international membership organisation and charity committed to the study of soil science in its widest aspects. We bring together those working within academia and practice to actually implement soil science in industry. And we plan to host 10 webinars during 2024, so please keep an eye out on our website for further details. Before we begin, I just want to do some basic housekeeping. As there are so many of you here today, it's fantastic to see. All your microphones have been muted. We will actually be taking questions at the end of both presentations, and we will be monitoring these throughout the webinar. So please could you submit any questions you have by 12:50 to allow us to get through as many as we possibly can. Although there is a raise your hand button, we won't be using this unless the presenter specifically asks for a show of hands. Today's presentation has been awarded BASIS and NRO SO CPD points. So if you are registered with either body, please contact us after the event and we'll explain how to claim those. And finally, please be aware that we are actually recording today's presentation. I would now like to take the opportunity to introduce you to our fantastic presenters, Gill Shaw and Rob Askew. Gill is a senior soil specialist and has tutored on the BSQ ALC course since its inception in 2014. She studied geography at the King's College London before taking an MSc in land and water management at Silsoe College and the Cranfield Institute of Technology. She's a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and is a full member of the British Society of Soil Science. She is BASIS soil and water management qualified and a chartered scientist. Gill has worked in both public and private sectors for over 35 years, covering a range of environmental and regulatory areas. She has extensive knowledge and technical understanding of the ALC system, and it's brilliant to have her here with us today. I would also like to take the opportunity to introduce the equally brilliant Rob Askew. Rob Askew is the director of his own consultancy specialising in soil science and land use planning based in sunny Devon. Rob is a fellow with the British Society of Soil Science and also a chartered scientist. He is also a registered environmental impact assessment practitioner with the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. He has over 30 years of experience in environmental research and consultancy. So welcome, Gill and Rob, and at this stage, I'd like to hand over to you both.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start the presentation today. So we're going to be here learning about the agricultural land classification system, its history, principles and practice. This is only an introduction and you'll begin to understand it's a much more complex and more detailed system than we can present in the hour that we've got here today. So Dom's going to forward the slides for us, so if you can move on. So we'll start off with the history, moving on again. So the ALC system as we see it today had its beginnings back in the 1930s with Dudley Stamp from the London School of Economics, who started the Land Utilisation Survey. And this was a field-to-field survey of the whole country, and it was looking primarily at land use. It used a vast array of volunteers to gather information across the country, including thousands of school children. And his idea was that it would be used to manage land and food production more efficiently. It wasn't picked up until wartime, when it was used for agricultural planning, when food security was a significant issue. And that idea of food security, the theme, can carry through right to today, when we know that we frequently talk about whether we're looking after our own food security at this time. And then post-war, it was used in urban planning. Moving on. So in 1962, the Agricultural Land Service held a conference, the classification of agricultural land in Britain, and this was looking at how they could look at the agricultural use across the country, because urban development was growing at a significant rate, and it was recognised that agricultural land, although it was required for development, it was also required for agriculture. And so they wanted to develop a system whereby the best land could be retained for farming and the poorer quality land could be used for development. So once again, we were looking at the food security issue too. They wanted to produce maps that could be standardised across the whole country. This time that included England and Wales. Scotland has its own system. You might say that this was perhaps the first ecosystems approach. Thank you, Dom. So what is agricultural land classification, or ALC as we commonly know it? It's a method for assessing the productive potential of agricultural land, and in ecosystem services that might be known as the provisioning measure. It's based on a key set of principles that's applied consistently across England and Wales, so it doesn't matter where you are in the country, the grade that you allocate the land would be the same, have the same meaning as it would in another part of the country. You need to recognise that it's not a map, although the maps are a product, it's a system, and the methodology can be applied a variety of scales, and so you'll see different scaled maps showing ALC grades. Importantly to note, it's based on field survey. It's not something that you would entirely do in the office, although you can do pre-assessment checks in the office. And it's based on soil, site and climate factors. So what are the principles of the ALC system? It looks at the permanent physical properties of the soil. It's not looking at things that can be changed, that the farmer can influence. And so these are things that the farmer is stuck with. If he's got stony soil, there's very little that he can do about it. If he's got a steep sloping field, there's very little he can do about it. So the ALC system looks at permanent physical properties. And it considers the fact that we want to be able to grow a range of crops, and so it's looking at the versatility. It's not just single cropping, it's looking at a variety of crops. It's looking at the consistency of yield and the cost of obtaining that yield, and also the levels. And it's based upon the most limiting factor, which is known as Liebig's law. And so the worst factor, the most limiting factor, is the one that determines the grade. Moving on. So the grades are, there are 5 grades, and the land's classified into these based going on the long-term physical limitations to agricultural use. And it's looking at climate, site, soil, and then also interactions between the soil and the climate. And these are known as wetness, dryness, and erosion risk. So in 1966, as a result of this conference that was held, the ALC system was born. Moving on. The technical document which supported the development of the system was called TAC 11, and it set out the criteria. And as a result of this, a national programme of mapping was carried out across England and Wales between 1966 and 1974. And this resulted in a series of 1-inch to the mile maps, which are known as the provisional map. 5 grades are shown, there's no subdivisions as there were later, and this map is now available at 1.25 million. This is actually more appropriate to the original use because it was considered to be used for a strategic use rather than specific sites. This 250,000 map is available on the Magic website, and you can download it or view it there. And there are also PDFs which are available for different parts of the country if you want to generate paper copies. And so it had the TAC 11 report, had the objectives and the system that was used to develop these maps. It's been widely tested at public inquiry ever since, and so is a well-recognised system. There are, however, some limitations to these provisional maps. Because of the scale that it was originally mapped at, it's only accurate to about 80 hectares, so it's not suitable for site-specific surveys. And the predominant map is grade, so within that there might be variations, and so as a result it would be misleading to enlarge the maps. These maps were produced before grade 3 was subdivided. That was later subdivided into 3A, B and C, and then the most recent system uses 3A and 3B. So it's not suitable for site-specific information, and so more detailed surveys are needed for these sites. So in 1976, the TAC 11 was further developed into TAC 11.1, and this was to try and deal with some of those issues. For example, in some counties, such as Gloucestershire, there was basically grade 3, which wasn't really very helpful for the planners. And so they wanted to develop a more refined system that would allow some of the subdivision of 3B to take place so that we could identify the better quality land from the slightly lower quality. And in 1976, grade 3 was subdivided into A, B and C. And this was when we started doing site-specific surveys, when we were trying to identify the variations in the grades, particularly around the grade 3. There were a significant number of surveyors who were trained in the system, and there was a lot of technical resources behind them. There will continue to be challenges at public inquiries, and again, the system was shown to be robust. And then in 1988, the system was further reviewed. The principles remained the same, but it became more objective in its criteria. And the guidelines produced in 1988, commonly at the time known as the Blue Book, Don, if we just go back a slide, were much more specific and had clear criteria for each of the limiting factors. And these are the guidelines that are in current use today. They've shown through public inquiries to be robust. So we can move on. And so as a result of the development of the ALC system over the years, from 1970s, site-specific surveys have been carried out. And there are a large number of maps showing the surveys which were carried out over that time. And in fact, the Ministry of Agriculture carried out over 6,500, and these are held by Natural England on their in their access to evidence catalogue, and they're available there. And so for each of these surveys, there would normally be a map showing the grades, the auger boring locations, and an accompanying map. They are generally at what we call detailed level, which is 1 boring per hectare, but there are some at semi-detailed and reconnaissance. There are also available consultants maps, because it's not only the government that was carrying out these surveys, individual consultants were also carrying out surveys. And so their maps are generally available either through the planning system for specific planning applications or from the individual consultants, but they tend to be a wide variety in availability. Next slide, please. So in summary, the agricultural land classification, as it stands now, has 5 grades, but grade 3 is subdivided. And these are the descriptions that are used for each of these different grades. Grade 1 being the best agricultural land, and grade 5 being the poorest. Moving on. So what does this actually look like on the ground? So these are just some cartoons just to show what different grades might look like. So grade 1, if a farmer's got grade 1 land, he's doing pretty well, and he can grow a wide variety of crops because he's got good agricultural land. Moving on to grade 2, has minor limitations, but you can still grow a good range of crops, and so the farmer there is quite content to. Grade 3 has got more limitations. Moving on, Dom. And it's mainly confined to some cereals, but grass, so it's good grazing land. A lot of dairying would take place on grade 3 land. Moving on to grade 4. We're now beginning to look at land with much more severe limitations, and so the outputs will be limited, and it's unlikely you would be growing arable crops on this land. It's primarily going to be grass and grazing. And then moving on to grade 5. Well, this is pretty poor land, and the farmer won't be able to get a great deal of output from his land, but it has, of course, it might well have other environmental benefits. What does this look like in reality? Here we've got some lovely grade 1 land in the east of England, very versatile. You can do a whole variety of different cereals and horticultural crops, and you'll get consistently good yields over it. Moving on to the next slide. Grade 2 land, again, you'll get very good outputs. You can grow a variety of different things, depending on where you are in the country, of course. And then moving on to the next slide. Here you can see, particularly in the main picture, probably grade 3 land in the foreground, moving into the hills in the distance where you'd be into grade 4 and grade 5. The smaller picture of pigs in the east of England is also on relatively poor land. You wouldn't have the versatility there, which is the key issue with the agricultural land classification system. Moving on a slide, I'll now pass over to Rob.
Yes, thanks very much, Jill, and good afternoon to everybody. I just want to briefly go through the legislation and policy context behind ALC. So next slide, please, Dom. So it's important to know that Natural England must be consulted on any development application that involves more than 20 hectares of best and most versatile land. And that's enshrined in the Town and Country Planning Development Management Procedure Order. So that gives us the legislative context whereby Natural England have to be consulted, and local planning authorities can seek advice from Natural England as the relevant statutory body. Next slide, please. So the ALC policy in England and Wales, effectively we're dealing with the best and most versatile agricultural land. This is the land that's been identified because it has value to future generations, and it's the type of land that we most want to protect because it's best suited to growing the more demanding crops and food. It produces the highest yields available to us. It requires less inputs in terms of fertilizer and land work, etc. And in general, it's most suitable to less intensive forms of agriculture. So this is why it's the land in ALC grade 1, grade 2 and subgrade 3A has been picked out really as a limited finite resource in England and Wales. And that's because it has most value to for those reasons explained. So current estimates of grade 1 and 2, we reckon there's about 21% of all farmland in England in this grade. And then subgrade 3A also covers about another 21%. So you can see of all the agricultural land in England, 42% of that's best and most versatile. When it comes to Wales, obviously there's a lot more mountainous regions and climate factors, etc. So it tends to be the land limited to coastal and lower land, lower elevations, etc. And in Wales, there's about 10 to 15% agricultural land. So that sets the context. So could I have the next slide, please, Dom? So in England, very quickly whizzing through, there's relevant policy in the National Planning Policy Framework, which was last revised on the 19th of December. As you'll all be aware, since the Labour government got in, there are plans to amend the NPPF, and so I'll be just dealing with that briefly at the end. But in short, you can see that in paragraph 180, section B, we have to, local authorities have to recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside and the wider benefits of natural capital and ecosystem services. And that includes the economic and other benefits of the best and most versatile agricultural land. Next slide, please. So within paragraph 181, there's a footnote 62. And in December 23, that footnote was expanded a little bit. So originally it used to just request that areas of poorer quality land should be used in preference to higher quality land. But they added in December 23, the availability of agricultural land used for food production should also be considered alongside other policies in this framework, and when deciding against most appropriate sites for development. So bear that in mind as we go through the next couple of slides. Next slide, please, Dom. So there are proposed changes by the Labour government. They came about, a consultation document was submitted this August, or August 24. Closing dates the 24th of September 24, if you do want to respond on that. Importantly, the revised NPF doesn't want to remove or undermine existing protections for BMV land. And so that includes where significant development of agricultural land is demonstrated. We should all seek, or local planning authorities should seek to use poorer quality land in preference to the BMV. Next slide, please. So as I said, footnote 62 was amended in December 23, but the government's questioning at the moment whether or not the availability of land used for food production is actually helpful and necessary, and actually has led to a number of objections based on the use of best and most fertile land. So the government are trying to streamline the system and speed up planning decision process. So at the moment, they are seeking to take that bit of footnote 62 out with regard to its usefulness as for food production. So I'm sure we have all our own views on that, but that's what they're seeking to do at the moment. Next slide, please. So in Wales, it's a similar situation. They have their own planning system, and the planning policy set out in Planning Policy Wales Edition 11. Again, reference to the best and most versatile lands, grades 1, 2, and 3A, because it should be conserved as a finite future resource. And again, basically a sequential approach to using lower quality land in preference to high quality land. Okay, next slide, please, Dom. So very quickly, in terms of environmental impact assessment, next slide, please, Dom. The Institute of Environmental Assessment and Management, IEMA, has recently published a new perspective on land and soil and environmental impact assessment. Well, it was actually published in February 22, but it's still the most recent guidance on how to go about assessing development projects that require environmental impact assessment. And you can download a copy of that guidance from the link provided here, and we can provide that link to those who want to seek a copy after this presentation. So next slide, please. There's also guidance provided in the Institute of Civil Engineers Environmental Impact Assessment Handbook, and that describes how to assess impacts on soils as well as agricultural land. And again, copies of that are available. So hopefully that's of use to practitioners. In terms of the EIA guidelines, the directive, I beg your pardon, they were last revised in May 2017. And they were revised in part to include impacts on human health, biodiversity, and importantly for our topic, land. Next slide, please. So basically, public and private projects should therefore consider and limit their impact on land, particularly as regards to land take and on soil. So you can see that the assessment of land and soil is now enshrined into UK EIA legislation. Next slide, please. So other useful guides produced by Natural England, the latest policy and description of the agricultural land classification system is set out in a very helpful note by Natural England on the government website, that link provided. And the British Society of Soil Science has also provided guidance, document number 2 on soils and land quality, and that sets out a very useful means to find maps and relevant data sets that would be useful to your impact assessment. Next slide, please. So I think that's back to you, Jill, at this point.
It is, yes. So to support the analysis that you might be doing in your environmental impact assessment, you need an ALC survey. And so we're now going to talk about ALC in practice, how you actually obtain that ALC information. So as I've said before, it requires field survey, and this needs to be done by skilled practitioners. As we go through the presentation, you'll realise that it's a complex system and it takes significant length of time for practitioners to become skilled in the ALC survey methodology. It's mainly done by soil survey, and that's using soil augers and hand digging soil pits. And a typical survey would do an auger boring every hectare. This is called a detailed survey. It also requires analysis of climate and site factors. Next slide. So who does the ALC survey work? Well, DEFRA and the Welsh Government are responsible for the maintenance and development of the system. And until 1999, MAF, as it was then, carried out much of the field's work in support of advice to planners. But in 1999, the Ministry of Agriculture refocused its survey work and in effect ceased to do survey work in England. But as Rob has pointed out, in Wales it's a separate system, and they can still continue to do field work. As a result of the government withdrawing from field work, private sector consultants do the bulk of all new ALC surveys, and these are mainly in support of large planning applications which require the EIA. Occasionally, new surveys for development plans will also take place. However, the archive that MAF produced, which is available on the Natural England website, can support this assessment of agricultural land quality in those situations. And Natural England and the Welsh Government are the only remaining dedicated technical ALC expertise in the public sector. So just to remind you again, the principles of the ALC system are that it's a framework for classifying agricultural land to the extent to which its physical or chemical characteristics impose long-term physical limitations on agricultural use. In other words, things that a farmer can change year to year are not included. It's the long-term physical impact characteristics that we're looking at. The 1988 guidelines are the main guidance. And as I said, the factors that normal farming practice can't change is what's considered. Field boundaries and economic factors are not included, although clearly in the past farmers put their field boundaries in sensible places, and this would often mark the difference between different soil types, and therefore they could manage their fields accordingly. Each limitation is assessed individually, and for each survey location, and then the most limiting factor determines the grade. So each limitation has to be assessed at each point. As I've said, field surveys are generally at 1 boring per hectare, and as a result of the survey, a map would be produced to show areas of the same grades. But if you remember, it's a system of guidance, not a map as such. So the limitations operate in 4 ways. They affect the level of range of crops that can be grown. They affect the level of yield and the consistency of that yield, and then also the cost of obtaining it. But you need to know that some land may be able to produce consistently high yields of some narrow range of crops. It also depends on a farmer how they want to manage their land, but that doesn't determine the grade of the land. So for example, you might find some very high quality land that is just being used for grazing because that's what the farmer wishes to use that land for, or you might find some poor quality land the farmer is willing to put high inputs in order to achieve outputs. For example, in Cornwall, on some of the very steeply sloping land, the farmers grow bulbs because this is a high value crop, but that land's not versatile, and so it would be regarded as low quality. So the key physical factors that influence grade are climate, the site and the soil, and these are the 3 things that the ALC system focuses on. Next slide, Dom. So looking at climate first, we look at climate first because this can have an overriding influence on land quality. If the climate is poor, then whatever the soil factors are, the land classification will be low. And the reason we look at climate is because it affects the potential for plant growth. So you find that the wettest and coldest areas of the country have the poorest land quality, whereas warmer and drier areas have a more favourable land quality. The climate data that we use to assess climate limitations in the agricultural land classification system is the 1941 to 70 Met Office data set, which has been interpolated on a 5-kilometre grid. And then for each specific site that you're looking at, you would do a further interpolation to obtain the climatic data that you require for the grading the land. And the data set is a set of average annual rainfall, accumulated temperature, maximum grade on climate, field capacity days, and moisture deficits for 2 representative crops, deep rooting wheat and potatoes. So this map shows the rainfall across the whole country on which the 5-kilometre data set is based. As you can see, the east is the driest and the west and the north is the wettest. Next slide. This is the average temperature across the country. Again, the east and southeast is the driest, the warmest, and the west and the northwest is the coolest. And finally, the next one. And this one shows the field capacity days. This is the number of days that the land, the soil is at moisture. The field capacity is maximum, and so it's saturated. And so the land in the east has lower field capacity days than the land in the west and north. Moving on. It's not only do we consider the overall climate, we also look at local climatic factors, because these can have an impact on the crops that can be grown. And the local climatic factors such as aspect, gradient and elevation influence the temperature, the frost and risk of exposure. So you might get frost pockets in hollows, and particularly on the west coast you'd have exposure, and these salt-laden winds from the sea can affect the crops that are grown. Moving on. Then secondly, we have climate and then site limitations. So the site limitations are gradient, micro-relief and flooding, and these can affect the machinery that can be used, particularly precision planting machinery, and also the risk of flooding. And for each of these limitations there will be a corresponding set of criteria that will be found in the ALC guidelines from 1988, and I've just included the one here for grade according to climate to show you the types of information that is available. Then soil limitations. The soil can have a significant impact on the types of crops that can be grown, and these are soil texture and structure, the depth, the stoniness and the chemical content of the soils. So I'll just look at those in a bit more detail. Next slide. So these are the standalone soil limitations. So for texture, we're looking at the proportions of sand, silt and clay, and in the field this would be analysed by hand texturing, although it can be backed up by particle size distribution analysis at the lab, but the vast majority would be done by hand texturing, and an experienced soil surveyor would be able to identify quite precise percentages of each of those different sizes of particle. Texture has an influence on a whole variety of different aspects of the crop growing, and this is why that we need to look at texture at each location. The structure of the soil affects the water movement, the amount of air, and whether roots can penetrate into the soil, and this all affects how well a crop can grow. And so we look at the structure. You can't assess structure in detail from an auger boring, so this is why we dig soil pits around the site to look at specific characteristics of the structure of the soils that we're looking at. The soil depth can affect the types of crops that can be grown in a variety of ways. The soil depth will affect the amount of water that's available in the profile. So if you've got a very shallow soil, there's not very much water available for the growing crop. If it's a shallow soil, the roots can't exploit depth, so the crops won't be able to, they might not be able to support themselves, or they don't exploit large water reserves. The anchorage of the crops might not be very good for a shallow soil, and also it affects how well the soils can be cultivated. And finally, stoniness, and the picture at the bottom shows the effects of stoniness. So you've got patches of a very stony soil, and that's limiting the amount of crop germination that's taken place. It can impact the wear and tear on machinery. It can make harvesting difficult. It also affects the types of crops that could be grown. So you wouldn't want to be growing root vegetables in a very stony soil, because that will affect the formation of the tubers, and then they won't be of high value. Next slide. And then there are chemical limitations. Now these need to be long-term limitations that the land manager cannot remove. So this isn't related to nutrient values, because a farmer can apply fertilizers and nutrients year by year. These are chemical limitations which the farmer can't do anything about. And in fact, it's very rare for this limitation to be the primary limitation, but we do need to be aware that it might occur, particularly where there might be limitations to the consumption of crops by humans because of toxicity. So you'd look at these case by case. It is an uncommon limitation. Moving on. So then we move into what we call the interactive soil limitations, and these are soil erosion, wetness and drowsiness. And I'll just look at these individually to give you a flavour of what they're about. So the next slide, please, Dom. Soil erosion can be caused by wind or water being the most common, and it's determined by interactions between the weather and the soil type and the topography and the amount of vegetation. So depending on whether you've got low flat land or sloping land, whether that land is, the crops are there in winter or summer, these are issues that will affect the soil erosion and therefore the versatility of the land. And so we need to take that into account. And you can clearly see the effects of soil erosion when it occurs, particularly by water with the formation of rills and gullies. The next one is soil wetness. So how does wetness affect plant growth? Well, if you've got a very wet soil, then seed germination and survival might be low. The root systems don't like to develop in waterlogged soils. You might find that when you're traversing the land, applying fertilizers, then you may get structural damage where you've got compression of the soil, and which squeezes out all the air and the pore spaces, and it affects how many days in the year that the farmer can get onto the land. So soil wetness is a very important limitation that we need to consider. And the way that we look at this is looking at the field capacity days, which is obtained as part of the climate data. And so the higher the number of field capacity days, the worse the potential situation is, because that means that the farmer would be able to get onto the land less frequently through the year. In terms of topsoil texture, the more clay content in the soil, then the heavier we call that soil, and that can affect the amount of warmth that can get into the soil for germination. If there's less porosity, then the roots are less able to exploit the PEDs and the pore spaces. As the structure in the soil becomes bigger and larger, then the soils are considered poorer. If you see glaying in the soil, then that's a clear indication that you've got a wetness issue. And you can assess the degree of the wetness by looking at the degree of glaying and the structure and where it occurs in the profile. And generally, if you see brown and boring colours in the soil, you can consider that those soils are better than if you see the grey glaying colours, then they're poorly drained. So a well-drained soil is the ideal versatile soil. The assessment method, it is complex, and I really wanted just to give you a flavour here. You need to assess the number of field capacity days, know the topsoil texture and the subsoil texture, which you would obtain through your soil survey. You'd be able to identify if there was glaying present and at what depth. So at what depth is the waterlogging occurring? Identify if there's an SPL, and that's a slowly permeable layer. So that's a layer of soil that the water finds it difficult to penetrate, and the depth at which that occurs will determine how high up water sits above that, and how waterlogged the soils might be and for how long. And as a result of all of those pieces of information, you can assess the soil wetness class, which is classes 1 to 6, 1 being the best, 6 being the worst. And in the ALC guidelines from 1988, there's flow charts and there's tables and there's graphs which take you through the whole process to give you an ALC grade in terms of wetness at the end. Now that might be the most limiting grade, or you might find that one of the other limitations is more limiting, but you need to go through that whole process to identify your wetness grade. And so you need to gather several pieces of information through your soil survey, through your climatic interpolation in order to identify the wetness limitation of that site. Next slide. And then soil drowsiness is the other soil interaction limitation. So how does soil drowsiness affect plant growth? To reach full potential, crops need to have adequate moisture supplies throughout the whole growing season. And so soil moisture is affected by the amount of rainfall coming into a site and the amount of evapotranspiration that's taking place from that site. And the balance of those is known as the moisture deficit. And that's a figure that is provided by the climate data. Then the water holding capacity of the soil is affected by its texture, structure, organic matter, stone and depth. And this will provide you with the available water for that particular soil in that particular location. If you transferred the soil to a different location, it would have a different climate regime, and so you would end up potentially with a different ALC limitation at the end, grade at the end. So the moisture deficit and the available water are used to work out the ALC drought risk. And these are calculations that are done in the field, and they are quite complex, and there are computer programs available that will do those calculations for you. But it's the sort of thing that you need to do in the field at the time in order to identify what the drowsiness risk for that particular soil is in that location. And so you might end up with, at the end of your survey, a mixture of different limitations, some drowsiness, some wetness, some slope, and for each location that you've done your sample, you need to identify the main limiting factor, and then you would draw up your map. And so you might have a map which shows an area of grade 3A, for example, but that might include different limitations that have all come to a limitation of 3A. But it's the limitation grade that we're looking at, not the actual specific limitations within that grade. The information that would be then provided in a report. So next slide, Dom, please. So I hope by going through those, very briefly going through the limitations that are part of the ALC system and how you do it in practice, you'll see that in summary it's quite a complex system, and that's why it takes a good number of years for people to be able to become experienced in doing ALC surveys. Next slide. I'm going to pass back to Rob for this. You're on mute, Rob.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so with regard to the British Society of Soil Science, this is an organisation where we've tried to set standards for ALC surveys that are being carried out. So there's a number of guidelines, guidance documents on the BSQ website. One in particular is a working document number 1, which sets out what you'd expect to find in an agricultural land classification survey. And I have my own work reviewed against these guidelines. And so it just ensures that you've dug a soil pit to describe soil structure, for example, that you've done the prerequisite number of auger bores per hectare, that ideally you've taken photographs and provide as much relevant description in the report as possible. And there's a tick list type approach to that. And it even gives a traffic light type system where green is good, orange is where somebody might have some concerns over that report or survey, and red is where you may have left something out and actually you can't really determine the ALC grade with the information in that report. So it's a very useful system and helps maintain the quality and integrity of these reports. So the BS has also runs an introduction to the agricultural land classification course. I believe the next one is in November. It's a 2-day course. As Jill mentioned, there's so many soil associations, about 292 soil associations over England and Wales, with about approaching 800 soil series. according to different parent materials and places that they've developed in the landscape. Each of those soil association and soil series has its unique set of characteristics, and so it takes a long time to experience a range of those. Hand texturing is an art. You can get laboratory analysis of topsoil samples to help ensure that your hand texturing is correct. But again, it just takes a lot of time to amass experience. And so the 2-day course goes through the whole procedure and provides some practical experience. But really, my recommendation would be to attend a separate course run by the BS as well, which is an introduction to soils, where you actually get experience of digging a soil pit and experiencing hand texturing and describing the profile. So whilst that goes that goes a long way to providing a background to agricultural land classification and the description of soil profiles, and the guidance notes available online will help those who aren't necessarily soil scientists but might be planners wanting to know when it's appropriate to carry out an agricultural land classification survey, and if they receive one done by a consultant, whether or not it meets the robustness that you'd hope from an ALC report. So next slide. Over back to you, Jill.
Yes, so I just wanted to say thank you for listening today, and a reminder that the next introductory to ALC course run by the British Society of Soil Science is in November, and there'll be details of the joining instructions for that in the follow-up email. I think we're handing it over to Chris now.
Thank you, Jill and Rob. So, hi everyone, I'm Chris McCloskey from Cranfield University and the British Society of Soil Science Early Career Committee. And we now come to the Q&A section of the webinar. If you have a question, please submit it by 12:50 to give us the chance to get through as many as possible, but we've already got quite a few. So firstly, a question from Willie Towers. Does ALC cater for interventions such as the use of stone separators and plastic, which will increase the range of crops that can be grown?
Shall I take that one, Rob? So, as I said, the ALC system is based on long-term physical characteristics, and so whilst an individual farmer might want to remove stones from his fields, stones are going to keep re-emerging, and so that would just be a temporary solution. And so it's not that versatility, and this is a system that is to cover soils across England and Wales. And likewise with using plastics to increase germination, that's a management technique rather than the long-term characteristics of the soil, and so a subsequent land manager might not want to use that. It might not be within their economic assessment of how they manage their site.
Jill, can I add to that as well, if I may? Because if you're getting signs of plastic on agricultural land, then clearly there's been some man-made intervention. So possibly the spreading of green waste. And again, that comes back to the content and the source really of that green waste. So that may be indicative of some chemical limitation. I'll come back to that in a moment. There are instances in the past where we've tried to use sewage sludge, for example, to improve nutrient status and organic matter in soils, but that increases the amount of heavy metals that were in the sewage sludge going into the soil. So you may get some form of contamination from either green waste or sewage sludge. So it's always good to find out a bit of history from the farmer if you're on site, chatting to him, how the land's been managed, what inputs may have gone on, because those chemical limitations, such as phytotoxic metals, copper, nickel, zinc, for example, aren't necessarily visible to the eye, but they can form part of the ALC process in downgrading the land. So yeah, maybe signs of plastic, for example, and that type of intervention gives you a heads up on other things to possibly check, such as a chemical toxicity, for example.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions from Hannah Bowley and Jason Gale, which are about the climate data set. In light of current change in climate, when are more recent climate data sets likely to be used rather than 1941 to 1970 values?
Yeah, shall I? I'll have a first stab at this, Jill, if I may. I think clearly the climate is changing, and there have been reports carried out by Cranfield University on predicting how ALC grades may change up to the period until 2050, for example. And in summary, it becomes clear that as the climate becomes drier, soils in the east of the country that were highly productive become less productive, for example, because of the extremity of the soil droughtiness. So we are limited at the moment in terms of we're assessing climate limitations from a climate data set between the 40s and the 70s. But the argument for maintaining the system as it is at the moment is that it forms a basis of comparison for all of that ALC data collected since 1988, when the climate data set was published. So if we were to change the climate data set, then we're no longer comparing like with like in terms of review, assessing the current ALC against previous ALCs. So it's a difficult one because clearly we need to reflect the climate as it becomes changed due to climate change. But then we would potentially lose our ability to form the comparisons with ALC data collected in the past. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Jill.
Yes, it has been reviewed since 1988 as to whether we should move to a more current data set. And at the time, the variations suggested that it was appropriate to keep using the same one. But as Rob said, we've now moved significantly on in terms of time and the data that's available. And so that a review of that and the impacts on what the effect it would have on the grades. But we need to remember that the changes aren't simple linear changes. There's the change in the frequency of the rainfall. So, for example, erosion would, if you've got more intense rainfall, that can have an effect on erosion. So it's not only the climate that it would affect, there's all other different factors within the ALC system. And so it is quite a complex analysis that would need to take place. And as Rob says, the key to the system at the moment is that it provides comparisons around the country. And so a survey that was done in 1999 compared to a survey that's done in 2010, because they're using the same system of variables. If you change that, you would have to change potentially remap all the surveys that have been done. But of course, with more modern computational systems and technology, that's something that is easier and certainly could be taken into account. But that's a decision for DEFRA and the Welsh Government to make as the guardians of the system.
Thank you. So now we have a question from S. Franklin. In your opinion, does soil health affect ALC grade? And if so, how?
I'll have a go at that one first. I believe soil health does affect ALC grade. Soil health is an umbrella term. We all roughly know what it means, but people and researchers are busy trying to set out what criteria we might actually measure in terms of describing and measuring soil health. But in my mind, at a sort of generic level, we're describing things such as soil structure, organic matter content, for example, in terms of the ALC system. So if you have a better soil structure and the soils aren't totally depleted of organic matter, then they will be more fertile, better aerated, and on the whole achieve a higher grade. And that is reflected in what we assess in the ALC system. So on the whole, a good soil health would tend to improve the ALC grade. Would you agree with that, Jill?
One of the considerations in the introduction to the ALC system is that soils have a good level of management, and I think soil management is very much linked to soil health. And so the ALC system already enshrines good soil management. And when we're talking about soil health, we often talk about how we can encourage farmers to manage their soils well. And so the ALC system and the criteria are looking at soils which have that good level of management, and therefore this contributes to the particular grade of those soils. And if you've got a poor level of management, which is the choice of that particular land manager, then you might have to consider whether you lower the grade, but you'd have to provide evidence for making that assessment. So I think that's enshrined in the ALC system already, a good level of management, good soil health.
Thank you. So a question from Sheila Royal. How confident can we be that planners understand ALC? My experience suggests limited understanding, and with council strapped for money, reluctance to send planners on ALC courses.
I think there is, again, a big danger there that they don't understand it. As a result of cuts, they don't have experienced people, they don't have ecologists, they don't have soils people in their planning departments. And so there is a tendency to take a map. It's a very good pictorial representation of something, and they take that as read. And that's partly why the British Society of Soil Science produced the document that Rob referred to earlier about how to assess a survey as to whether it's valid or not, and not to take things at face value. And so we hope by providing that supporting evidence to them that they can make an analysis of the map of themselves. But of course, they can always refer to Natural England or the Welsh Government if they're not sure for their technical expertise.
Great, thank you. I think we have time just for one more quick question. So from Peter Kohler, apart from being protected from development, are there some agricultural practices that are not to be carried out on the BMV land, such as practices leading to loss of soil fertility over time, like high tillage? If so, could you give some examples?
I think that comes back to what we just the question we answered previously about soil management, and that the ALC system assumes that soils are well managed. And what you're describing in the question is poor soil management. And so we wouldn't encourage that type of management to take place.
Great, thank you. So I think that's all we have time for today. On behalf of the British Society of Soil Science, I'd like to express our thanks to Gill Shaw and Rob Askew for coming along to present today. Thank you all for attending. You'll find a quick feedback survey when you leave the webinar, which we hope you'll take the time to complete. The recording of this webinar will also be available after the event on our YouTube channel. As Jill and Rob mentioned, BSQ is holding an introductory course into ALC, which will be taking place from the 13th to the 14th of November at Cranfield University. Details about how to sign up are on our website and will be in the follow-up email, along with some answers to questions we didn't have time for today. We also wanted to bring to your attention our upcoming annual conference, which will be taking place in Cardiff in December. The theme is Sustainable Soils for People and Planet. Tickets are on sale now, and submission for poster abstract is also open, so it'd be fantastic to see you all involved. Our next webinar is scheduled to be on Wednesday, the 2nd of October, so keep an eye out on our website for how to register. I hope to see you at future events, and in the meantime, thank you again and goodbye.